Once in a high secure prison that I worked in, a man who'd been convicted of murder. At his murder trial, when the judge convicted him, he threatened to kill the judge when he got out. But he became a Christian in prison. His life was transformed, and by the time I met him, he was an ardent evangelist.
This is Convicted, a podcast highlighting the work of Daylight Christian Prison Trust. Join us as we hear from ex-offenders, chaplains and volunteers.
Thanks for coming in today. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks, David. It's great to be with you. So my name is Dr. Mark Pickering. So my main role these days is to lead the Christian Medical Fellowship. That's a national membership charity across the UK and Ireland. We support Christian doctors, nurses, midwives and students. So wherever these particular healthcare workers have a discipleship need or a support need, then we aim to support them in lots of different ways. And part of that is through supporting them in their particular workplace challenges. So that's my main job, but I'm also a GP as well. I still do some GP work, just about a day a week these days. And I do that in secure environments. So part of that is in prisons. Part of that is in secure mental health units or forensic psychiatric units. That was actually my original route into working in prisons some years ago, which we'll come to talking about, I'm sure.
Thanks for sharing that. So Mark, tell us just a little bit, just for listeners, where did you grow up? And if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit about how you became a Christian.
I grew up in Yorkshire, in a city called Hull. My parents both Christians, so I had a Christian upbringing, going to church and Sunday school, and that was all a lot of fun. I was your typical mischievous young boy. And, went to things like church kids camps and things. So I remember various times when there was talk about, would you like to give your life to Jesus? And that was never a problem for me. So I probably, did a number of those commitments when I was a young child. The time that I remember things really making sense to me was when I was about 12 or 13. I just remember sitting in church one evening. Don't remember who was preaching, what they were talking about. I was struck by the thought that, I believe this stuff, I don't doubt the things that I've learned, but it's not making a difference to me, and it really should. And so that was the time that I started to think, okay, now I need to live as a Christian. And I was just reminded of that recently. There's a verse that Paul talks about in one of his trials towards the end of Acts. I think he said they should turn to God and repent and prove their repentance by their deeds. And it's that, that whole link of faith and deeds. And yes, the faith comes first, but then actually your life needs to change as a result of that. And so that was the point when I thought, okay, now this is serious. And there's, lots of other times since then. Times at other youth camps, somebody challenged me to get serious about the Bible when I was 16. They talked about reading the whole Bible. So I went back to my bunk bed, read the first 5 chapters of Genesis, and then just sort of kept going and, sort of gradually gone through it, many times since then and really benefited from that. So that was sort of childhood, teenage years. I ended up going to medical school. I married my wife when we were at medical school down in London. She's also from Hull. We knew each other a little bit as young people as well and children. And then we both ended up as doctors. And then I'm back down in London now at the moment.
Sure. Thanks so much for sharing. So, as you said, you're a doctor, you head up Christian Medical Fellowship, do a bit of work in prisons, and you've worked in secure mental health units. Tell us a bit about that. What's that like, Mark?
It is absolutely fascinating. So the way that happened was I was working as a GP in Yorkshire, and I was just working as a normal GP in a practice, and then one day an email came round from the practice manager to say, we've got this contract in a medium secure forensic psychiatric unit, and we need a GP to do a couple of clinics there a week. And I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. I thought everybody else in the practice would be interested in it and that there'd be fierce competition to do this. But I said, well, I'm interested. What does it involve? And actually, I was the only person who showed any interest in it. And so I got straight into that. And then I ended up going to this forensic psychiatric unit where there are people who are detained under the Mental Health Act, usually because they've committed crimes that are related to their mental health situation. So many of them have got, say, schizophrenia, often schizophrenia that is either not very responsive to treatment, so they still have symptoms, or that they've been refusing to take their treatment and then committed crimes while they were under the influence of that. And, because some of the symptoms are things like paranoia, thinking that people are against you when they're not, or sometimes having hallucinations and believing that people are out to get you when they're not. And so sometimes that can, very sadly erupt into violence or other things, or stalking people and that kind of thing. And so that it's a very small subset of people with schizophrenia and other related conditions, but that's the sort of population that we have. And so I ended up working there and just doing the basic physical health things for them, working with the psychiatrist who looked after their mental health. But it just opened my eyes to a completely different world of people who don't have the freedom to, go out and see whichever doctor they want. They don't have the freedom about which GP to register with or when they get to go and see them. If they're worried about their health, they can't just go down to A&E, get another opinion. They're very much dependent on people saying, yes, you can, or no, you can't do this. And as a Christian, it really just struck me that, here is a group of people who are made in God's image, who, for various reasons have got difficulties. And not everybody wants to go and work with that population. It's often difficult and challenging. People may be rude or occasionally physically unpredictable, that sort of things. Occasionally there's violence in situations like this, although it's usually well controlled within that environment. And so not a lot of people want to go and work there. But I just thought this is actually an amazing place to work. If you're there as a Christian thinking, here are people made in God's image who have got amazing dignity and value, and actually they need help as well. And so I was kind of sold on it from then. And I worked there for a couple of years. And then I saw an advert for a prison job, which was similar, and that was also in Yorkshire. And again, this was in a national medical journal, and I thought, probably lots of people interested in that. I think I was the only person in the whole country who applied for that job, and so it wasn't difficult to get into it. But then a similar situation, and the population's slightly different in prison in that there are lots of people with mental health problems, but not everybody is. It's a situation when, people aren't always the most polite to you. There's a lot of challenges there, and not everybody wants to go and work there. But I just was also struck by, these are people who are made in God's image. There's an awful lot of difference that we can make. And if we're wanting to serve God, this is a great place to do it. God wants us to be salt and light, then shining a light in a dark place like prison or a secure mental health unit is a great place to work.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering, as a GP, obviously you have professional responsibilities to those you're serving, but tell us about what opportunities are there for us to share the gospel where you are, or to serve God where you are. Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And people do often think, are you able to do that? What are the rules around that? And the General Medical Council, one of the things that they say is that you should adequately assess people's situation, and that includes spiritual factors. So actually, if anyone says, you can't talk about faith, it's like, well, no, the General Medical Council says you should do. Clearly, there are boundaries, there are ways to do that or not to do that. But faith and spirituality is often very important to patients. Even if you just think of, well, there are Christian patients there, and, to be able to think about how their faith impacts how they feel about their medical situations, then it's good to be able to ask that. Then there are various other people with varying views on faith, and it's just good to know what people think about that. So just asking simple questions. One of the things that I will often say if I'm in a clinic when people are, say, coming into prison for the first time, they're often upset, they're often feeling quite down, understandably. One of the questions I will sometimes ask is, do you have a faith that helps you when you're in a difficult situation like this? And sometimes they'll say, yes, I do, and then they'll go on to talk about it. Sometimes they'll say, well, I did, but I haven't really thought much about it recently. Or sometimes they'll say no. And you often get useful information from that. But it's a great conversation starter. And sometimes it goes on to a good conversation like that. Sometimes I might ask people whether they ever pray about their situation. Surprisingly often people do. If you don't ask, you'll never find out. Then sometimes, even if the conversation doesn't seem like it's opening up, I might just drop something in like, mention that I'm a Christian myself, that I find, faith very important, especially when life is difficult. or it's an opportunity to make sure that people are aware that there's a chaplaincy in all the prisons. Like yourself, David, I know you work as a chaplain at Doncaster Prison, and just to be aware that the chaplaincy is there, tell them a little bit about it, and also just to say, these are great people to talk to whenever you need some support, even if you don't particularly agree about the faith side of things. So there are great encouragements that you can do. And then occasionally I've had some amazing conversations with people in prison. I remember having a wonderful conversation with, I think it was a Muslim imam who'd ended up in prison, and we were talking about the interaction of faith and works in Galatians after we got talking through a series of conversations. And so I never thought I'd be having that sort of conversation, but that was just something that came out from a conversation with him, and he didn't mind at all the fact that I was a Christian and speaking as a Christian. I remember once, this was during COVID, when we were having phone consultations with people from my clinic room into their cells. And I asked him at one point, this was a mental health consultation, whether he had any kind of faith that helped him when he was struggling. And he said, "Oh, it's funny you should ask that, Doc. I'm just actually doing a piece of artwork. I'm painting a big cross on some cardboard, and I'm doing it with tea bags." He brewed up some strong tea, and he was using that as paint to paint a cross on some cardboard so that he could focus on that. I forget exactly what the state of his Christian faith was, but if you don't ask, you just have no idea what's going on in people's lives. So there are lots of opportunities to talk about faith, to encourage people in thinking about faith, and at various different levels. One of the things I love about prisons is that there is always a chaplain there. Yes, there are chaplains of different kinds, Anglican, Catholic, Free Church, Islamic, and then other faiths as well. But faith is a conversation that people are comfortable with generally, and that it's easy to get into within a prison environment. One of the things I'm often reminded is that people in prison don't generally need to be reminded that they need forgiveness. That's sometimes an easier conversation than it might be for people on the outside, because for people in prison, even if they don't think that they're guilty of that specific crime that they're being convicted of right now, they generally know that they've done bad things in life, and that forgiveness is something that we all need.
No, again, fascinating stuff, Mark. I understand that you kind of work and you help kind of encourage, equip other doctors or other health professionals within prisons. Is that right?
The Christian Medical Fellowship, we have 4,500 members all around the UK and Ireland. A handful of those that I know of work in prison, so I know a number of colleagues who are Christian prison GPs. I know some Christian prison nurses as well. And also, as I've worked around in different prisons and secure environments, there are a number of Christian staff there. And one of the things that has struck me quite forcibly in recent years is that there is no network, no organisation that supports them. So it's wonderful that we have chaplains in the prisons, chaplains generally focused mostly on the prisoners, absolutely, and that's where the primary need is. Lots of other church volunteer groups who come in alongside the chaplaincy will maybe come in and do some discipleship or other work with supporting prisoners or supporting ex-offenders when they come out of prison. These are all fantastic, but I'm not aware of anything that's really focused on supporting Christian prison staff. And because of my own experience at the Christian Medical Fellowship, I know just what an amazing value that is for Christian workplace ministry. We have lots of other partner organisations for Christian lawyers, Christian teachers, Christian allied health professionals, Christians in the army, Christians in the police, etc. But there is nothing for prison workers. There is a group called Christians in the Ministry of Justice. So in the MOJ head office environments, there are Christian networks, but really not very much at all within prisons. And so we do have a few contacts in different places, and at the moment, it's a WhatsApp group and an occasional online prayer meeting with a few of us, but I would love to see that grow. And, if anyone is listening to this podcast as a Christian prison officer, prison governor, any other kind of person working in the prison network, or a chaplain such as yourself, David, who I know has a vision for supporting Christian prison staff, I would love to hear from you, and I would love to be able to see a network like that grow, because we mentioned about being a light in the darkness. It's tough working in prison, supporting often difficult people in difficult situations, and to be a Christian in that environment, it's not easy to be salt and light there. Think of the amazing effects that there could be of a national network, a national fellowship with support groups in different establishments that can actually be praying for each other, be supporting each other, be thinking about what does it mean to be a Christian working in the prison service, like a missionary calling, etc. I would love people to be thinking, I want to go into prison as a Christian in order to be part of what God is doing there. Individuals, I know, do that from time to time, but I'd love to see a fellowship and a community that grows up to do that.
Yeah, brilliant. No, I agree. I think that's a wonderful thing. Let's move on slightly then. What's your take of the temperature, if you like, or some of the opportunities or challenges currently in our system?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that there will always be challenges with things like overcrowding. So, if you listen to the news and you think about news within prisons, so there's often different situations when the prison population is overcrowded, and that makes it really difficult just to manage people there or to spend the time that we need to with the people that we've got. So the government not long ago, looked to reduce some of the sentences for sentenced prisoners, to release some more people early to relieve the overcrowding. Things like building new prisons, thinking about sentencing guidelines. These are all things that governments have to do to manage that flow, but it certainly follows through into the staff. And when you've got a high turnover of people, of prisoners coming through, often it makes it difficult to focus on individuals. And I think that's a real shame when staff who want to do a good job supporting and helping people through their prison journey don't have the time or the opportunity to do that really well as they'd like to, because there is an amazing opportunity for rehabilitation, for helping people as they go through that journey, so that they're not just becoming what we call revolving door offenders, when very often people will come in from an unstable situation, often perhaps addicted to drugs, with mental health problems, not engaging with healthcare, unstable housing or family situation. And if we're not careful, we can end up just booting them out the other side to yet more instability. And, it's very easy for them to just go back into old habits and then end up back in prison again quite soon. So having the time and the space to actually help people properly, help them to move on and help them to build up their lives again, be rehabilitated, is really important. One of the other things that often swings from the pendulum is drug strategy. So sometimes different justice secretaries will often want to be tougher on drugs, or, do a more supportive situation for that. And those things just trickle down into the healthcare staff in different ways. But I think certainly the ability to help people with their addictions when they come into prison, very often we need to stabilize them, say with methadone treatment or with alcohol detoxes. And that just gets them over the initial hump. But then to think, how can we support people to move on in their life so that they're not ruled by getting the next dose of whatever medication or illicit drug there is. There's often a big drug problem in prison. There's always pressure for the prisons to try to clamp down on drugs coming into prisons, to help to stop prisoners using illicit drugs within the prison environment, and then to get them off that onto a more positive lifestyle, and then to maintain that when we get out. So I think that, those are some of the kind of situations that are always there at different times. So, good prison management is incredibly important. We've talked more about sort of chaplains and healthcare workers and perhaps individual officers, but for the people who are supporting prisoners day to day, officers, governors, managers, it makes an incredible difference to be able to do that well. Good leadership is a gift from God, and for those who can go into the prison service actually wanting to lead it well, to put good policies in place, to implement them well, to support staff in how they do that, is a massive opportunity as well. So I think those are some of the opportunities and challenges that are separate just from what happens with the healthcare day to day.
Thank you. What advice would you give to, say, a Christian doctor or a Christian health professional who is maybe thinking about working in a prison or a secure mental health unit, but kind of isn't sure maybe? And then what about someone just more generally who wants to get involved in prison ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for anyone who's interested, I would say, explore that interest further. So for a healthcare worker, it might mean either contacting anyone you know who's working in prison healthcare. So I'm very happy to take queries. I've often pointed people in the right direction, or I've had lots of students or other doctors come and shadow me for a day or part of a day, just come along with me, see what a clinic looks like, get an idea of what that might be, and then maybe go on from there. There are healthcare roles in prison, so, for nurses or other healthcare workers or doctors, wherever you look for your job opportunities, like the British Medical Journal or other NHS jobs websites, if you search for prison healthcare or offender healthcare, there will often be roles around. And I would say just explore those and think about that. Think if you're someone who's not a healthcare worker and you're thinking, I wonder if I can get involved working with chaplaincies, then often local churches will have opportunities there, or you could simply contact the prison. You can find their contact details online and then get in contact with the chaplaincy and find out what are the opportunities for coming in. And it may be that there's already a well-established prison visiting chaplaincy partnership with one or two local churches, and the local chaplains would be able to put you in touch with them. In order to do that regularly, then you certainly need to have some security screening. That's usually fairly straightforward, and you get some orientation for that. But I would really encourage people to consider that if this is something that piques their interest. And I think if anyone thinks, do you know what, I've sometimes wondered about, working as a prison officer, I would say do explore that as well. It's not as scary as it seems. Prison can be a challenging place to work. It's not for everybody. And so you need to have a relatively thick skin. You'll deal with people who can be often rude and demanding. And certainly prison officers sometimes do face violence from prisoners, but that's all managed. Everyone's, trained to deal with that sort of thing. And I think it's generally less scary than you think. I've been amazed over the years by often how grateful prisoners are that you're there, when you don't have to come there and look after them. I've had a lot of gratitude from prisoners, and, there are some brilliant prison officers that I've worked with as well. So I would say if you think God might be nudging you in that direction, have a look into it, do explore it, and see where the Lord takes you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now we're coming towards the end of our time together. Do you have, Mark, a favourite Bible verse or favourite Bible passage, or maybe just something that has encouraged you recently?
Yeah, I certainly do, David. And the passage that I will often think back to is towards the end of Genesis, when it's the story of Joseph in prison. And this is something I will often speak with about people. So I mentioned about when people are coming into prison, and I'll often, have that brief conversation, maybe ask them about faith, ask them how they're doing, that sort of thing. And sometimes when faith comes up, or particularly, if you have someone who's a Christian or even a Muslim as well, because they're also aware of the story of Joseph. And I talk about that passage and I'll say, are you aware of the Joseph story? And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. But I just tell them briefly about how Joseph ended up in prison. In that situation, it wasn't anything that he'd done wrong, but he ended up in prison. But God had not forgotten him, and amazing things happened to him in prison. He was a great help to others. God was there with him, and then he ended up being Prime Minister of Egypt. That might not be the case for every person who comes through prison in the UK, but God can do amazing things. And, God does do amazing things. I have been incredibly encouraged by some of the stories of transformation that I've seen of people who have either come to faith or come back to faith within prison. One of the most incredible stories I remember was once in a high secure prison that I worked in, at the funeral of a man who'd been convicted of murder. At his murder trial, when the judge convicted him, he didn't say, "Thank you very much, Your Honour." He threatened to kill the judge when he got out. So he wasn't a nice man at that time. But he became a Christian in prison. His life was transformed, and by the time I met him, he was an ardent evangelist and would share his faith with many of his fellow prisoners, and the transformation was quite striking. He very sadly got a brain tumour, and he knew that he was dying. But at that time, we went through caring for him, and as he died within the prison environment, many people saw that he hadn't given up on his faith, that it was still a great comfort to him, and they'd seen that transformation. And so I was able to speak in the prison chapel at his funeral service with lots of other prisoners there, with some prison officers there, just about the transformation that God had made in his life, and the fact that he had been able to face death bravely, positively, knowing that he was going home to his Lord. And what an opportunity, what a transformation of someone from darkness to light within the prison environment. And so I'm always encouraged by the opportunities that there are. And, that's a relatively rare situation and a dramatic one, but these things do happen large and small ways. So that's one of the reasons why I will often say to people, amazing things can happen in prison. That's why that Joseph story always encourages me.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, what a story. Okay, and so just last question then, Mark. I'd love to know, how can listeners be praying for you?
Well, thank you, David. I think for the times when I'm in either the prisons or the secure environments, just for wisdom, I think very often in life, I love to ask this question about, Lord, show me who I should be pausing with today, what questions I should be asking somebody, lead me to the person who needs a bit of extra time or, just a conversation, maybe to uncover something that they're not coming to me with straight away with, but, maybe that question behind the question, and then suddenly you open up something that really helps people with. So praying for having the wisdom to know who to pause with, which questions to ask, where to go with the conversations that come up. And I think to be salt and light with the staff around as well. So bringing it back to what we've said before about, I think there are such opportunities for Christians as staff to support each other and to work with each other and to help each other to support the people that they're looking after. And so I would really ask for prayers that that vision for a prison staff Christian network will become a reality, and that we'll see that across the country in different prisons and secure environments much more than it is today.
Mark, thank you. Our time has almost come to an end. Thank you so much for sparing some time today to talk to us. It's been really fascinating. And yeah, I'll be praying for you. I'm sure listeners will be too. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Convicted. You can share and subscribe this podcast and also leave us a review. Doing so helps increase the visibility of this podcast and increases the possibility of others hearing about the good news of Jesus Christ and how he's at work in our prisons. This podcast is produced by Good News Broadcasting. To find out more, go to gnba.net.